Today I want to talk about Jean Lafitte. Sometimes called John Lafitte, sometimes called Jean Lafitte. He was an actual historical figure whose legend has grown up and been incorporated into some of the lore and history, the stories of the different rides at Disneyland. What fascinates me about Jean Lafitte is that there was a grand vision to unify the Haunted Mansion, Pirates of the Caribbean, and also Tom Sawyer Island, all under the umbrella of this historical figure, Jean Lafitte. He was an actual guy who operated as a privateer and as a pirate in the Gulf of Mexico in the early 1800s. And his relationship with Disney kind of reminds me of Disney's relationship with Davy Crockett, who was an actual person, but who also had a legend grow up around him. And Disneyland adopted some of the legend and some of the actual historical facts about the person Davy Crockett to fit their needs whenever they needed him to fit into a story that they were telling around Disneyland and American history. Jean Lafitte is similar. He's also famous for having built a series of tunnels around New Orleans near the waterfront, and also had some of his smuggling operations in Barataria Bay and Barataria Island, which are right off the coast of New Orleans. He was also involved in the War of 1812, specifically the Battle of New Orleans, which I think, my history isn't great, but I think was one of the final battles, if not the final battle, of the War of 1812. And Jean Lafitte sided with the Americans against the British to defend New Orleans. As a result, Andrew Jackson, Old Hickory, rewarded Jean Lafitte with a full pardon for all of his misdeeds over all of the previous decades. All of the smuggling, all of the pirating, that was all just written off. Thanks for your help. We're all good now. Let's talk about Jean Lafitte, the legend, specifically as it relates to Disneyland, and even more specifically as it has been used to unite Haunted Mansion, Pirates of the Caribbean, and Tom Sawyer Island, which was an idea that never totally came to fruition. The idea to unite these three different attractions in New Orleans Square originally came from Imagineer Eddie Soto. And Eddie Soto was this brilliant Imagineer who came up with this idea that a crypt entrance would be built near the Haunted Mansion, in fact, right across from the Haunted Mansion, and you would walk down into the tunnels of this crypt. It would be like the catacombs of Paris, sort of. It would go underneath the rivers of America. It would connect Tom Sawyer's Island to the Haunted Mansion, and also through the legend that would be told, connect the Haunted Mansion as well. This idea never happened. I mean, as anybody who has been to Disneyland can tell you, there is no crypt that goes underneath the rivers of America. There is no grand unifying legend that unites these three rides. But it is really cool to think about. And the more I read about how this was attempted and the idea behind doing it all, the more I realize that there is so much more to know. So I want to give a big thanks to longforgottenhauntedmansion.blogspot.com. This is a blog about the Haunted Mansion that came up with this great theory using all kinds of evidence to show exactly what the grand unified story would be. I'll put a link to the blog in the description below. Definitely check that out because it goes into way more detail than I'm going into today. But I do want to touch on some of the elements. Jean Lafitte's name can be seen all over Disneyland. Lafitte's Landing at Pirates of the Caribbean, that's where you board the boats. If you look up, there's a sign right there that says Lafitte's Landing. Also on the shores of the rivers of America near the Mark Twain Riverboat Landing, there's a great big anchor. And if you read the plaque that's on the anchor, you'll see that it belonged to Jean Lafitte. It also says something snarky about not believing everything you read. So partially actual history of a real guy, partially Disney lore. Also, there used to be a store in New Orleans Square called Lafitte's Silver Shop. It's no longer there. And if you look on Tom Sawyer's Island, you'll see a big sign over what was formerly known as Harper's Mill that is now called Lafitte's Tavern. So the name Lafitte shows up again and again as you become more familiar with Disneyland and New Orleans Square specifically. But what seems to spark the most conversation and interest from Disney fans is a bricked up sunken archway that can be seen on the Rivers of America Esplanade that's right out front of the Haunted Mansion. What is it doing there? What's the purpose of this thing? The theory was this idea to have a crypt and a tunnel that somehow connected the Haunted Mansion, Pirates of the Caribbean, and Tom Sawyer's Island would be accessible through this bricked up entrance. We now know that that's not actually the case. Soto had planned to build a big entryway right in front of the Haunted Mansion, and that would have been the entrance to the crypt, not this sunken archway. Nevertheless, it is a cool little piece of mystery at Disneyland, and for people like me who are big fans of Disney lore, and especially fan headcanon type of lore, seeing this bricked up archway is like, oh, what could this be? I don't know what it is. Let's speculate. We also now know that the original story for the Haunted Mansion, which was originally written by Ken Anderson, involving a sea captain, the woman who married him discovered that he was a pirate, and in a rage he murdered her and then had terrible regrets and hung himself. A lot of us have heard that story, but what has come to light in more recent years is that there was an even older story by Ken Anderson, the original story of the Haunted Mansion, that actually incorporated Jean Lafitte into that story. The sea captain that was the owner of the Haunted Mansion was a compatriot of Jean Lafitte. And if you want to learn more about going down this rabbit hole, again, I recommend longforgottenhauntedmansion.blogspot.com. Check it out. It goes into a lot of detail about many of the different appearances of Jean Lafitte over the years, lending support to this theory that someday we might actually get an official unified theory of these attractions in New Orleans Square. For me, the most fascinating part of all of this is how official Disney stories get mixed around with fan theories and kind of pop out completed on the other side. They take shape over the years, and what was once fan theory becomes official canon for the Disneyland stories that are told of these different attractions and of Disneyland itself. So that's the story of Jean Lafitte and how this actual historical figure became part of Disneyland lore and history. So that's all for now. Thanks for watching. I will see you next time.